The hospital corridor was quiet except for the slow beep of the heart monitor echoing from the ICU. Imani, a 45-year-old black nurse with dark brown skin and tired eyes, stopped dead in front of a new portrait hung near the director's office. A smiling blonde boy in a small white coat, his hands around a stethoscope too big for him. The gold plaque below read, "In loving memory of Ryan Carter, beloved son, 1995 to 2003. Her breath caught. The air left her lungs like a punch. "Ma'am," she whispered, voice trembling, "that boy was raised in my orphanage." Across the hall, Dr. Ashley Carter, the hospital's director, a white woman in her 50s, froze mid-conversation. She turned slowly, confusion shifting to irritation. "Excuse me? What did you just say, nurse?" Imani's voice rose, stronger now. "I know this child. I raised him when he had no one. He called me Mama Imani." The hallway went silent. Orderlies stared. Even the machines seemed to pause. Ashley's face tightened, the kind of polite smile rich people wear when they're cornered. "That's impossible," she said coldly. "My son died 20 years ago." Imani took a step forward. "Not from where I come from, ma'am. That boy didn't die. He was taken." The portrait's glass reflected both women, the powerful white director and the black nurse who had spent her life cleaning blood and changing sheets. For years, Ashley had spoken down to her, questioning her qualifications, mocking her accent. But tonight, one photo had shattered the wall of silence between them. The sound of Imani's heartbeat filled her ears. She remembered the boy's laugh in the orphanage yard, the way he used to draw the same house over and over again, a big white house with tall columns and a garden fountain. The same mansion, now hanging on the hospital's fundraising poster. Ashley's voice turned sharp. "You're delusional. Watch your tone." But Imani didn't back down. Her eyes glistened with memories and rage. "No, ma'am. You watch yours. Because I know the truth about what really happened to your son. If it's already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now. Because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them." Morning sunlight spilled through the hospital windows, bouncing off polished floors that smelled of bleach and power. Imani moved quietly between patient rooms. Her ID badge faded from years of double shifts. Around her, younger nurses chatted in clipped tones. They avoided her not out of rudeness, but fear. In a place run by Dr. Ashley Carter, loyalty was measured in silence. Ashley's voice echoed down the hall before she appeared. "Imani, you're late logging your vitals again. We've discussed this." Imani kept her head low. "Yes, ma'am. I stayed a little longer with Mr. Jenkins. His breathing was heavy last night." Ashley folded her arms. "You're not paid to play therapist. Finish your rounds and keep personal stories for your church group." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were routine. For months, Ashley had treated her like background noise, someone to manage, not to respect. The staff called it the Carter tone, that soft cruelty polished by wealth, designed to remind people like Imani of where they stood. In the break room, two orderlies whispered over coffee. "Did you see the director's wall? Her son's portrait looks exactly like the kid from the old St. Mary's home downtown." Imani's hands tightened around her cup. St. Mary's, the orphanage where she spent 15 years raising abandoned children. She had left that place after a mysterious funding cut closed it down. Rumors said the land was sold to a private foundation, the same one that now financed the hospital's new children's wing. She pulled out her worn wallet. Inside, folded carefully, was a crayon drawing, faded blue sky, a white house with tall columns, a boy's handwriting at the bottom. "For Mama Imani, when Daddy comes back." Her throat tightened. That drawing had survived floods, job losses, and eviction notices. She had promised the boy she'd keep it safe until he found his father. But she never expected to see that father again, smiling from a golden frame with hospital donors shaking his hand. Ashley's voice cut through her thoughts again. "Imani, board meeting in 10. Clean up the east corridor before you clock out. Don't make me repeat myself." Imani looked down at the drawing one last time before slipping it back into her wallet. Her heart whispered the same prayer she'd said every night at St. Mary's. Lord, if truth has a voice, let it find me. That night, it finally had. The next morning, whispers rippled through the hospital. Something had changed. The night staff said they'd seen Imani outside the director's office long after closing, standing in front of the portrait, her eyes wet, her lips moving as if in prayer. When Dr. Ashley Carter arrived, her heels struck the floor like a warning. Nurse Imani, my office. Now. Inside, the room smelled of expensive perfume and polished wood. Ashley closed the door, then turned sharply. You embarrassed me yesterday in front of donors. You will not speak about that painting again. Do you understand? Imani's voice stayed calm. I didn't embarrass you, ma'am. I told the truth. That child, Ryan, wasn't buried under marble. He grew up in St. Mary's with us. Ashley's expression hardened. You're accusing me of what exactly? Kidnapping my own son? Imani shook her head slowly. No, ma'am. I'm saying someone took him, and you helped cover it up. The silence stretched until even the clock seemed afraid to tick. Ashley walked to her desk, picked up a file, and tossed it toward her. You've been a good nurse. Imani, don't ruin what's left of your career. Sign this resignation. Take a severance and walk away. Imani didn't move. Her fingers grazed a folder, but didn't open it. I buried too many children whose parents never came back. I won't bury the truth, too. Ashley's face flushed crimson. You think you can threaten me? I've given this hospital 20 years, built on stolen stories. Imani interrupted quietly. That portrait on your wall, the new wing with your husband's name, funded by the same foundation that shut down our orphanage. You turned that place into a parking lot for your donors. Ashley froze. Her eyes flicked toward the drawer where she kept old contracts. Imani saw the tremor in her hand. I kept records, Imani continued softly. Intake logs, adoption papers. The children you said went missing in the fire. Ryan Carter was one of them. But you already knew that, didn't you? Ashley slammed her palm against the desk. Enough. You're finished here. Security will escort you out. Imani met her eyes, unflinching. You can call them, ma'am. But when they come, I'll be ready with proof. For the first time, the director's confidence cracked. Her voice trembled. What proof? Imani leaned closer, her tone steady as steel. The kind that talks louder than money DNA. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. Ashley froze. DNA? She repeated, the color draining from her face. Imani reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a thin envelope sealed with tape. From a routine blood draw last month. The hospital lab ran a double entry by mistake. Your donor file matched a closed adoption record from St. Mary's. Ashley laughed once, a sharp, brittle sound. You expect me to believe some accident links my family to a random orphan file? Imani laid the report on the desk. The page trembled slightly in Ashley's hands as she read the heading. Genetic correspondence 99.8. Maternal relation confirmed. Ashley's chair scraped back. This is illegal. You access-detected data. Imani cut her off softly. The system did. I just didn't delete what it found. The air thickened. Outside, a storm rattled windows. Thunder rolled like judgment. Ashley pressed both palms to her temples. You can't possibly understand. My husband was drowning in debt. The investors, they wanted a child to present for the charity fund. It was supposed to be symbolic, a model of hope. The adoption papers were never meant to sell him. Imani's voice cracked with restrained fury. You turned that boy into a signature on a check. He begged for you every night, ma'am. Drew pictures of you. Said one day his mother would come back wearing a white coat. Ashley's breath hitched. Stop. No, Imani said firmly. You stopped pretending you loved him. You left him to rot while you built your empire on sympathy. For a long moment, neither moved. Rain hammered the glass. The portrait on the wall seemed to stare at Ashley, accusing. The office door opened suddenly. Malik, the hospital's legal advisor, a calm black man in his 30s, stepped in. Director Carter, you asked for counsel? His eyes shifted from Ashley's trembling hands to Imani's calm posture. What's going on? Ashley tried to gather herself. This nurse is making outrageous claims. Imani handed Malik the report. Outrageous truth, sir. And I'm filing it with the health board and the press tonight. You may want to read the part where it lists St. Mary's Orphanage as property acquisition. Carter Foundation, 2005. Malik scanned the page, his brow furrowing. That's a felony under child welfare law. Ashley's knees gave out. She sank into her chair. I was told the children were relocated, she whispered. Imani looked down at her, tears threatening but steady. Relocated to graves marked unknown. I buried 3 myself. Ashley's sob broke through the thunder, but Imani didn't gloat. She simply stood, straight-backed, the stormlight reflecting in her eyes. The truth always finds its way, ma'am, she said quietly, even when you hide it behind charity plaques. The hospital boardroom was never meant for truth, only for polished lies and smiling donors. But that morning, every seat was filled. The air was heavy with the sound of phones buzzing, reporters calling, and whispers bouncing off glass walls. Imani stood beside Malik, the legal advisor, as the board chair cleared his throat. Dr. Carter, before we begin, we've received disturbing documents regarding the St. Mary's Orphanage acquisition. Would you like to explain? Ashley Carter sat pale and hollow-eyed. Her pearls look heavier now, like a chain she couldn't remove. This is being exaggerated. She began weakly. A clerical mix-up. Old paperwork resurfacing. Malik placed the DNA report on the table. Ma'am, that's not a clerical error. That's a child's life. Ryan Carter's adoption record was falsified under your signature. The same funding that closed St. Mary's was routed into your foundation's private account. Gasps filled the room. A camera flash burst through the door's window. The press had arrived. Ashley's voice cracked. You can't let them in. This is confidential. Imani's voice was steady. So it was the life of every child you sold for a donation receipt. The chair slammed his gavel. Enough! We're suspending you pending a federal inquiry. Ashley looked at Imani, the woman she'd mocked for years, her voice trembling. You think they'll believe you? A nurse against me? Imani took a step forward. They'll believe the recordings, ma'am. Every meeting where you called those children projects. Every time you said people like me should be grateful for the job. Malik added calmly, the Justice Department has already subpoenaed your files. The FBI is on its way. You might want to call your attorney. Outside, reporters crowded the entrance. Microphones flashed. Someone shouted. Director Carter, is it true your charity laundered money from missing children's funds? Ashley buried her face in her hands. God, no. Imani turned to Malik. I didn't do this to ruin her. I did it so those kids wouldn't stay forgotten. Malik nodded. You did what the system never could, spoke truth to power. From down the corridor came the echo of heavy boots. Federal agents arriving. The boardroom doors opened, and a voice called her name. Dr. Carter, we have a warrant. Imani didn't smile. She simply whispered to herself, Ryan, you can rest now. The city skyline blinked with blue and red lights as night fell over the hospital. What had begun as whispers in the corridors was now a full-blown scandal on every news channel. Reporters stood outside the gate, shouting questions over the storm. Dr. Carter, did you sell orphans for profit? Did you falsify medical records? Inside, Imani watched from the staff lounge window. The glow of flashing sirens reflected in her eyes. Not joy, not revenge, just quiet justice. She had spent years cleaning the floors of this building, wiping away other people's mistakes. Tonight, the dirt was visible for everyone to see. A nurse entered, nervous. Miss Imani, they just took Dr. Carter out in handcuffs. Imani nodded slowly. Then it's done. Downstairs, Malik stood near the main entrance, speaking to agents. When he saw Imani, he approached gently. They're charging her with fraud, child trafficking, and obstruction. The Foundation's accounts are frozen. Everything you documented checked out. Imani's voice was soft. It wasn't just paperwork. It was lives. Malik handed her a thin folder. This came from federal custody records. They found surviving files from St. Mary's. Some of those children were relocated. 2 of them sent letters addressed to Mama Imani. They never reached you. Her eyes welled up. She opened the folder, messy crayons, uneven handwriting. Thank you for the soup. When I get out, I'll visit you. She smiled faintly through tears. Ryan used to write like this. Curved R's, always too big. Outside, a news van broadcast her face without realizing who she was. Unnamed whistleblower nurse exposes decades of corruption. Imani stepped into the hallway. The same corridor where she had once whispered in fear now echoed with her steady footsteps. Doctors moved aside. Patients smiled at her as if they already knew. Malik called after her. You heading home? She shook her head. No, I'm with the orphanage grounds. I think the children deserve flowers where their names were erased. The elevator doors closed slowly. Inside, Imani looked up, whispering, For you, Ryan. For every child they tried forget. The door slid shut, carrying her into the night where justice at last had a name. 6 months later, sunlight poured through the tall windows of a small, newly built orphanage on the city's east side. A gold plaque at the entrance read, The Ryan Carter Foundation, in memory of every child who wasn't heard. Inside, Imani moved down the hallway, the sound of children's laughter following her like a hymn. The walls were painted in bright colors, blues, greens, yellows, the kind Ryan once used in his drawings. On her desk sat that same faded crayon picture, the White House with columns and a garden fountain, laminated now, framed in glass. She ran her fingers over the paper and whispered, You finally got your home, baby. A little boy tugged at her uniform. Miss Imani, are we really going to park today? She smiled, bending to meet his eyes. Yes, sweetheart, but promise me one thing. Never stop believing that you matter, no matter what anyone says. Outside, reporters had gathered again, but this time their cameras weren't hunting scandal. They were documenting hope. The headlines no longer said corruption exposed, but Black nurse build home for forgotten children. Standing beside her, Malik handed her a folder. The settlement came through. The government's releasing the seized funds to expand this foundation across 3 states. Imani nodded, her eyes on the playground. Let them build more homes. More laughter. Malik smiled. You did it, Imani. You turned pain into something holy. She exhaled, her voice calm. No, we did it. Truth did it. A gentle breeze carried the sound of children singing. For the first time in decades, she felt light. Not because the fight was over, but because justice had finally spoken in a voice louder than hate. She looked toward the sky, whispering, Rest now, Ryan. They can't bury the truth anymore. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.